Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. My guest on today's episode is Ken Levy. He teaches law at LSU in Baton Rouge. His new book is Free Will, Responsibility, and Crime. But, the questions about free will, which, of course, theologians and philosophers have been debating for many, many hundreds of years, do bear importantly on our sense about what is responsibility and what therefore should be the role of our criminal law and our criminal legal system. But it does also bear on so many other aspects of life, right down to individual social interactions, as you'll hear Ken and I discussing in this really, I have to say, and this is the word I used with him a few minutes ago, a rollicking conversation about deep things like free will and responsibility, even in this time, and maybe especially in this time when our country is so preoccupied with the coronavirus pandemic. I hope you'll enjoy this episode. And I also want to say I hope everyone will be safe. Since we're talking about free will today, I want to say to you that I hope everyone makes good and safe choices to protect yourself, your loved ones, and your community. While staying safe, please enjoy this episode of Good Law, Bad Law. Stay tuned. Well, we are living in some very strange times right now and some very scary times as this coronavirus pandemic spreads, and fear and worry for ourselves and our loved ones and our businesses and our employees. So I think that this is the perfect time to take a little break and think about something that is not infectious disease related exactly, at least not exactly, and that is the whole subject of free will, the topic of a new book by my guest today, Ken Levy, who is a professor of law and a philosopher at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. So first of all, Ken, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Well, thank you for having me. I should just say I loved your podcast. You've done so many excellent interviews, and I just wanted to put that out there. So thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. We all like to hear that kind of thing, and that positive feedback, and I do really appreciate that. This is, as I said in the intro, this is a very this is a time when people may be questioning some very deep, fundamental questions about who we are as human beings, who we are, and what will be our fate as a species. So the idea of free will, which is so central to our humanness, does isn't a completely uh, irrelevant topic today. I think it's something that even when we're not really actively thinking about it, it's something we're aware of on some level. So let's get into it and tell us a little bit about yourself, Ken. I'm worried about Louisiana. My mother actually was born and raised in Shreveport. It's not that far away from where you are, and we're certainly reading in the news that Louisiana is one of the places that people are particularly concerned about. The rate of increase in the number of cases of coronavirus there. So it's and of course I'm in Philadelphia, and not that far away from the biggest epicenter of this pandemic, New York City. So these are some really scary times. Again, I think times where we are asking big questions and deep questions. Tell us about yourself and how you got into being a deep thinker on the subject of free will, and the book, and what your goals were in approaching a subject that certainly has been tackled before. What brought you to the topic, and what you are trying to do that's new and different in your book, which, by the way, I should give the name of it: Free Will, Responsibility, and Crime, an Introduction. So tell us about yourself and about your book.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and it's published by Routledge. It came out, well, the copyright says 2020, but it really came out in September.
Mm-hmm.
It's really the work of almost a quarter century on my part on the topics of free will and responsibility. And I've been teaching criminal law now for the past 10 years at LSU, Louisiana State University Law School. And so over the years, I've been publishing articles and thinking very hard. This is really since my dissertation at Rutgers, my PhD dissertation, which I wrote between 1996 and 99, on free will and responsibility. I just became obsessed with this in grad school, and haven't really, the obsession never stopped. And I guess this is a kind of a good obsession to have, because it is an escape from the dark times we live in. So my background is I fell in love with philosophy my first year of college at Williams College in 1987, and majored in it. Couldn't get enough of it. Went off to grad school. Still couldn't get enough of it. Spent 8 years there. Wrote this dissertation. Went to law school at Columbia Law School. Well, the idea was I wasn't confident I could get a teaching job, so I figured I'll have a few more years to learn something outside philosophy, and then integrate them. And that's pretty much how it worked out. Now, I did have to practice for a few years after law school, which for me was not the most pleasant experience. But that's another story.
Well,
I learned a lot. Let's just put it that way, and it wasn't entirely about the law.
yeah, yeah.
So, and then I went back into academia. Got a teaching fellowship at Harvard Law School for 2 years, and then like I said, I've been at LSU Law School for the past 10 years. So all that time, I've been thinking and writing about, among other things, free will and responsibility. This is probably at the heart of my research and my interests. And yeah, so that's, the book is really kind of a collection of I mean, it's 9 chapters. They're not, I mean, some of the chapters are tightly connected, but some are, for example, the last chapter is on addiction, indoctrination, and their implications for responsibility. And those are not necessarily tightly connected to the previous chapters. But the thing about the free will and responsibility area is there's many, as you can imagine, many books and many articles, almost on a daily basis coming out. So, but all of that literature, that voluminous literature, really focuses on a few questions. So in each of the chapters, I try to address one of those questions. And so I hope people will pick it up. I really do try to write in all my work, but certainly in this book, in an accessible way. It's not just for philosophers who can often speak in jargon.
Right.
I tried to make it as untechnical as possible. I am actually forcing my advanced criminal law students right now to read it, and so far the reviews have been very good. I mean, they feel free to criticize me, as at least some already have.
Well, let me put it
Yeah.
this way, Ken. Do they have the free will to give you an honest review of your book?
Well, so one of the every time I have mentioned to people, not familiar with my work, what do I research, what do I write about, and I tell them free will, that's the first question they always have is, do we have it? So and in the early years when I was writing about this, I realize that that's the last thing that philosophers really address. They're much more interested in the possibility of free will and the possibility of responsibility, and so you see them kind of talk about that. And even those who say it's possible generally don't go into whether it's actual. Now, I'm generalizing. Obviously, there are philosophers who do go there. So I've always made a point to try to bring it back to that question: do we have it? But I think the harder question is whether it's possible. So I do spend a good deal of time in the book addressing that question. But once I think you make the case that it's possible, I think then it's just a short leap to saying, yeah, and I think this is actual. But that's for philosophers, that's the less interesting part.
Well, and I'll just quickly add my review too, because I've made it through about half of the book so far, and I'm enjoying it. I do enjoy philosophy, and I do enjoy philosophy that bears on the law, particularly, that is, our ability to be responsible, because ultimately the question of whether we have free will and when do we exercise free will, and when are there forces that may impair our ability to exercise our free will, has tremendous impact on the law. And as you point out in the book, not only in the criminal law, but in all kinds of ways that people interact with one another, in because decisions that we make obviously can have a significant impact on others. And so I think it's a really important topic. I think you're right. It's important that it be accessible, and I think the book satisfies that. We will, as we always do. We'll put a link to the book and how people can get a copy for themselves in the description for this episode. But let me pick up on something that you just said, which is the question that so many ask, which is, do we have free will? I would think that most people assume that we do have free will, and that wasn't always the case, of course. For many centuries, when the church, capital C, the church, had a much greater influence on thinking. It was assumed, I think, by a lot of people, and you do talk about this, that we had a much more deterministic relationship to our actions, that things were foreordained, that there was some role in destiny, that God was controlling our actions, and we were simply fulfilling uh, uh, the choices that were made for us. But in the modern era, would you say that the challenge in trying to understand the gray areas around the question of free will are because we assume actually that we do, and we assume that others do have free will?
It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting how our attitudes and beliefs about free will have changed over the millennia. You're right. I mean, so way back when, the main problem used to be the problem of divine foreknowledge, and so theologians and philosophers tried to reconcile God's omniscience, his knowledge of all future events, with free will. So how,
Mm-hmm.
and so that, and then it becomes a question of how do you define it. So at one very common way to think of free will is the ability to do otherwise, the ability to choose, the idea that I have at least two options in front of me. I use this example a lot in the book: eat the cookie or not eat the cookie.
Mm-hmm.
You're on a diet, you're trying to resist, but there it is right in front of you, and it looks like you have two genuine options there. So with the problem of divine foreknowledge, the problem was, it seems that if God already knows I'm going to eat the cookie, then I have no choice but to eat the cookie. I'm not free to refrain from eating the cookie, right? And so they tried to work that out, and there were various strategies to reconcile God's omniscience with free will. Now the dilemma or it became sort of more so in the 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries, that what if the world is determined? Take God out of the picture, and we have a Big Bang that came out of nowhere, and all the, the laws of nature and all the matter kind of swirled around, but everything was determined, uniquely determined from that point forward. Well, we are products of that Big Bang. We are matter in motion. So we are just as determined as any other object, a rock, a leaf. I use the example of billiard balls a lot in my classes. And so we are just very, very complicated billiard tables, but it's a difference in degree, not in kind. We are just as determined as the motions of those balls. And then if you think, well, our brains determine what we do and how we decide and how we choose, well, our brains are just very complicated billiard balls or billiard tables. And so the question is there room in that picture? It's really the Newtonian physics picture for free will, because the Newtonian physics basically said you have the laws of nature, which are, rigid and inflexible, unchanging. And then you have all this matter, and once you set up the initial conditions of the universe, plug in the laws of nature, you have the whole entire future of the universe determined. It can't go any other way. That's the Newtonian physics picture. Well, in the 19th and 20th centuries, people start thinking about indeterminism and quantum indeterminacy, and then they say, aha, so we can have free will. Newtonian physics is wrong. Indeterminism opens up room for free will and responsibility. And so a lot of people sort of breathed a sigh of relief and said, we're free, we're responsible, that's the end of it. But a lot of philosophers came along and said, no, that is not, doesn't give us any more free will than determinism did, because now everyth's just random. Now, we have a neuron randomly firing. That doesn't give us free will. So that's just as incompatible with free will as the determinism is. And so those philosophers who still exist today, in fact, it's a growing movement of skeptics, right? Responsibility and free will skeptics. They just think it's metaphysically impossible to have free will and responsibility. And I would say that group, which again is growing, is kind of the main source. They're the main motivation for a lot of the literature. Either they're supporting it or people are trying to oppose it. Now, it's not the only question, but I would say that's probably the primary question. Is free will, I'm just going to stick with free will. There's a complicated relationship between free will and responsibility, but is free will possible at all? And so those skeptics say no. There's really two other groups I should just mention quickly. One is the compatibilists, and the other are the libertarians, and it's metaphysical libertarians. The compatibilists say, wait a minute, you're defining free will in this really odd way. We need to define it differently. And once we define it in that different way, it's perfectly compatible with determinism. So that Newtonian physics picture is perfectly compatible with free will. And then the metaphysical libertarians say, no, that's not true. But the skeptics aren't right either. Actually, you do need indeterminism, but it is compatible. Indeterminism is compatible, not only necessary, but compatible, not only necessary for, but compatible with free will. And so you have three kind of camps: compatibilists, libertarians, and skeptics kind of fighting it out. And it all swirls around that central question: is free will possible? Now, there are other offshoots. There are other questions they're dealing with, but that is what really drives the literature. And that's largely what my book is about: is spelling out their positions and the implications of those positions, and then trying to see who's right in that whole debate.
Well, you said that free will, or our ability as human beings to make choices, especially choices about our actions, has a complex relationship with responsibility. I mean, I'm not, I guess, approaching this so much as a philosopher, but thinking about the meaning of those ideas as a lawyer, and as a citizen, I guess too, um, it strikes me that while it seems pretty obvious, and we could come up with all kinds of examples of situations where our otherwise free will can be impaired by other forces. You mentioned, for instance, addiction, or insanity, or there's others we can think of too. Um, but if we don't have free will over ourselves, we don't have self free will and the ability freely to make choices. Uh, it seems to me we would then there is no responsibility for any action, and that's so I'm having a hard time imagining the skeptic's position. If there's no free will, I mean, do they then go so far as to say, natural extension of that argument, that there's no responsibility for our conduct?
Some do, yeah. So some have taken the radical, and it doesn't mean it's false, but the radical position that free will is metaphysically impossible. Therefore, free will is necessary for responsibility. Therefore, responsibility is metaphysically impossible. And but what they most of for example, Dirk Karaboom is one of them. Galen Strawson, Greg Caruso. There are a growing bunch of them who take that line, but then they try to reconcile that with everyday practices, including the criminal law. Now, some will say, well, we still need to punish criminals, at least for violent crimes or the most serious crimes. But they'll give non-desert reasons, non-free will reasons.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
We'll explain that, because that's
yeah.
important. That's important. Yeah.
Yeah. So they'll say nobody deserves anything because none of us are free. But somebody who commits murder, for example, still needs to be locked up. And there are two main reasons. Not that they deserve it, because nobody deserves anything, but one is that it'll generate very good consequences, like mainly crime minimization, right? So when if you go to jail for murder, and assuming you did it, and you're convicted, that'll send a message to everybody else that, Aaron went to jail for murder. I don't want to go there. I'm not going to murder. So general deterrence, it hopefully will deter you from murdering again, just being locked up like that and deprived of your liberty. It might give the victims closure. It might rehabilitate. You might be rehabilitated. There's all sorts of good consequences that may flow from that, even though technically you didn't deserve it because you're not free. You didn't freely murder. The other theory that's closely related is expressivism, which is that we need to send a message. We need to stand up for our values. And when you flouted society's values by killing somebody, society needs to stand up and say, we're not going to take that. And you need to go to jail for that, even though we recognize you're not free. You didn't freely do that. You still unfreely flouted our values, and we need to send a message that we won't stand for that.
Well, I mean, that last part seems pretty pretzel-like to me. I mean, but I mean, the general deterrence argument I can see, which is that if you say we don't have free will, therefore we can't be deemed responsible, certainly not morally responsible, for our bad acts, and therefore we and nobody can actually be deemed to deserve punishment for those bad acts. You can't deserve to be punished for something that you didn't actually choose to do, but we can lock you up so that you don't do it again. I mean, that I can see at least has some logical consistency, but specific deterrence, which is that you're going to dissuade other people from similarly acting badly, doesn't seem to make as much sense to me, because all those other people you would hope to deter don't have free will, if that's your way of seeing the idea of free will. And so how could it possibly deter anybody? Because we're just acting without choice.
So skeptics and compatibilists, but I'll just talk about skeptics right now. They recognize they're basically skepticism is compatible with behaviorism, right? And behavior is, like think of B.F. Skinner, we're all rats in mazes, and you just have to give people the right carrots and sticks, basically,
I see.
to mix
Yeah.
metaphors here.
Yeah.
And if you, even if we don't have free will, carrots and sticks can change our behavior, incentives, right? So even if we're all determined, throwing carrots and sticks in there can help be one of the factors that determines our subsequent behavior.
Okay. So we're
right?
not
So it's perfectly
autonomous thinking, choice making, free will motivated actors. But we could still respond to incentives, motivations, a bit, a smite on the head with a stick. Those kinds of things could influence our behavior in one way or another.
Yeah, punishment becomes just one more cause in the matrix, one more billiard ball impacting us. But the subsequent trajectory of those billiard balls is equally determined. It's just so it's not inconsistent with determinism. I should just mention those are the skeptics. I mean, compatibilists, think that even if determinism is true, even if we're just as determined as a rock, a leaf, or a billiard ball, we are still responsible. So they don't hold this view that metaphysical, the kind of the metaphysical free will that we were speaking about before is necessary for moral or criminal responsibility. They think it's enough that we did it, right? You killed. So that's even if you didn't freely in some deep metaphysical sense. And so Stephen Morse, who you had on as a guest a few episodes back, he's one of the principal compatibilists. And he just says you have to sort of rethink free will and what it is. It's not some, it's not this where I have two choices in front of me and it's completely undetermined. I made the choice. So eat the cookie or not eat the cookie, and I eat the cookie. Well, I decided to eat the cookie. I willingly ate the cookie. And even though maybe I was determined to eat the cookie, I still did it. I still performed that action. Therefore, this self, this I that did that is responsible. And now going to the murder example, you murdered. Maybe you were determined to murder since the Big Bang, but you still did it. And therefore, we can hold you, this billiard ball, if you go with that analogy, responsible for that action. So so maybe you really didn't have a choice in the metaphysical sense, but nobody put a gun to your head. Nobody forced you. Nobody compelled you. This you willingly did on your own, and therefore you're responsible. So I wanted to highlight that distinction. Both compatibilists and skeptics think let's assume the world is determined. One group says, fine, we still have moral and criminal responsibility. The other says we don't. They might still agree on punishment, though, right? Just for different reasons, right? The compatibilists think you still deserve punishment. The skeptics say, well, you really don't deserve punishment, but it's going to do all these good things.
Yeah.
So,
right. So
yeah.
they get there just through a different path. All right. So what
right.
if you have the view that we do not live in a determined world, and that that things may well have been set in motion by the Big Bang, but that was an awfully long time ago, and I'm pretty remote from that originating event to a life. And here I am, and at this point, my choices are not determined. I determine them, and I have at least two choices at any time: eat the cookie or not the cookie, and that is up to me. I mean, which group of thinkers in relation to free will are the non-determinists or the indeterminists?
Well, so I call them metaphysical libertarians just to distinguish them from political libertarians. Although I do try to show that political libertarianism presupposes metaphysical libertarianism, and in chapter 6. But yeah, so the metaphysical libertarians say this quantum indeterminism is basically the key to solving the riddle here, right? In order to have at least two genuine options, eat the cookie and not eat the cookie, it must be the case that when presented with that choice, I really genuinely could go either way. It's not that. So on the determinist picture, it's an illusion that I could have done otherwise. So let's say I eat the cookie. It was an illusion that I could have refrained from eating the cookie.
Mm-hmm.
Little did I know all the billiard balls knocking around in my head, my neurons, my brain, the laws of nature were all going to lead me to eat the cookie. I didn't know that though. So I thought, aha, I have a genuine choice here. I got to deliberate. I got to think about this. I got to make up my mind. And then I ate the cookie. Well, the metaphysical libertarian says, no, you really could have gone the other way. You ate the cookie, but you genuinely, under the very same circumstances, the laws of nature, the Big Bang, your environment, everything that's ever happened, your entire history up to that moment, you really might have gone the other way. You might have refrained. And so if you're on a diet and you ate the cookie and you look back, the metaphysical libertarian points his or her finger at you and says, you might have tried harder. You could have tried harder, and had you tried harder, you might have succeeded. So it's all on you. And that, I think, before you said most people today think that we have free will, I think that's the picture they have. If you're, I haven't taught philosophy classes in a long time, but the philosophy 101 student who's new to philosophy, and you're presenting the problem to them, I think intuitively most of them, and therefore most of society, think that, I have these genuine options in front of me, and it's entirely up to me which I choose. And that picture, that genuine, option having, is necessary for me to be genuinely responsible, both morally and criminally. And so the compatibilists and the skeptics come along and say they each try to debunk that intuition. I mean, the compatibilists say, no, you don't need that genuine option having to have free will or to have responsibility. You can still have responsibility on the cheap, basically. And then the skeptics come along and say, your intuition that you have these genuine options and therefore you're responsible for which option you choose, that's bunk. You don't have these genuine options, and you're not responsible. So I would just say that metaphysical libertarianism is the most intuitive position. Oddly, though, or ironically, it is the least popular position among professional philosophers. There are a few, principally Robert Kane, who have endorsed it in a number of really, really brilliant books and articles, but it still remains the most unpopular position.
Well, that's so surprising to me, because to me, again, thinking as somebody who wants to take these big ideas and bring them down to the ground where we live, and see how they affect our views on other big questions like responsibility, like punishment, um, you know, uh, the whole question of desert. Do we deserve to be punished? Can we shape individual human choices and groups of individuals and their choices to better fit with our society's values, norms, rules, laws, whatever? It seems like giving human beings, or recognizing human beings as having real choice, is the only way to do that, because everything else becomes an opportunity for human beings to disavow responsibility, uh, and provide excuses or non-rational basis for non-responsibility, for not holding people responsible. I mean, it's just so surprising that the one group of thinking that would give the most freedom of will, of choice, would be the least popular.
Yeah, well, this is, I think, fairly typical of philosophy in general. That it in every area they say you think X, right? This is your intuition, right? And then they proceed to give an excellent, irrefutable argument that your intuition just can't be right. And this is, I think, the fun of philosophy. I mean, a lot of philosophy is paradoxical,
Yeah.
right? It you have sort of some unreflective intuition, and then they give a powerful, uh, again, seemingly irrefutable argument that your intuition just cannot possibly be right. It's not a matter of it conflicts with the empirical data. It's just that there's no logical way this could be true.
Yeah.
And so then the problem is to try to figure out what's wrong with that argument. Now, compatibilists and skeptics have basically bitten the bullet, and they've said we accept this really powerful argument that free will, in the sense defined before as genuine open possibilities, just can't be what it is. I mean, it just can't be actual, or can't be true. So we're going to find other ways to So some will try to reconcile it with the institutions, like criminal law. Others will say we need to radically reform criminal law. In fact, responsibility skepticism or free will skepticism is kind of part of the criminal justice reform movement. I mean, they want to, I would say it's not at the heart of it, but they want to say, look, I mean, we got to be much, much, much more understanding of why people commit crimes in the first place. And the most understanding reason would be they just didn't freely do it.
Yeah.
Now, there have been hints of this over the last, I would say, 100 years, with rotten social background and certainly the insanity defense. There's, the duress defense. There are various excuses that we recognize that somebody didn't freely do something. What they want to do basically is extend that to all behavior, but they realize the dangers of that, because you can't just get rid of the criminal law, and they recognize that. So for one approach that skeptics have taken is that we should treat crimes like we treat public health problems, which we're going through right now. Nobody is responsible for. We could argue about this, but let's just assume as a given that nobody's responsible for contracting coronavirus.
Yeah.
And let's say you contract it, and let's say we're in the same studio, and you're asymptomatic, and you really don't think you have it, and I come into the studio, I don't have it, and let's say it just turned out you gave it to me, okay, and I get very sick. Now, most people, and let's say we could prove all that, somehow the causation. I don't think most people would say you're a bad guy, that you should go to jail because you did hurt me, right? I mean, let's say I die from this, right? You arguably killed me, but I think most people say you're not responsible for that. You didn't freely do it. You didn't knowingly do it, right?
Well, but hold on a second. Let me ask about that, because we are now relating this to something that a lot of people are thinking about. I mean, there are, I'm sure, all sorts of non-responsible transmissions of this terrible virus from one person to another, but we're all reading some of the horrible stories of some really dumb, reckless things that people are doing. I mean, there's a guy I just read today who went into a supermarket and coughed on all the produce, and he knew what he was doing. And they had to throw away $35,000 worth of produce because they were concerned that he could have infected it. I mean, that person, assuming they're not, mentally deranged or have some kind of brain tumor that that deranges their thinking, their rational thinking. I mean, if that person could be assumed to be a rational actor who is aware of what he's doing, to the extent that that person causes someone else to get this virus, I mean, how is that person not responsible for that?
No, it's a fair point, and I don't deny that person should be. I've seen a number of stories like this. I don't deny that they're committing a crime. It's always interesting what crime. I mean, but that is intentional behavior. It's designed to harm people. My point was that we tend to think of disease as we don't blame the disease carrier for contracting the disease.
Yeah. Okay.
We might blame them for intentionally infecting others. I mean, so if you think of if you think that we're, as skeptics do, that none of us have free will, then the minority among us who are committing crimes have a virus that the rest of us don't have. That's the way they think of it. It's not that they freely decide to commit crimes and therefore are responsible. They just have a virus that the rest of us didn't catch. And so when they commit these crimes because of this virus, this crime virus that they have, we should, how do we deal with them? I mean, so the analogy is with somebody carrying coronavirus who either does or doesn't know it, but they have the virus, they can't help manifest the symptoms. And one of the symptoms of having the crime virus is criminal behavior. So assuming that picture, what do we do with them? And one answer is we take a public health approach to criminals, and we in a sense, quote unquote, quarantine them, but we don't punish them. And you might say, what's the difference? You're locking them up either way. The difference is in the message. Right? If we quarantine a virus carrier, we're not saying you're a bad person. We're not saying shame on you. You go spend 10 years in isolation to think about what you did. It's none of that. That's the message we're sending with punishment. We're just saying you have the crime virus, and until you get rid of that virus, we're not letting you out.
Yeah.
And so it's not about blaming and punishing and retribution and all that. It's merely about making sure you're no longer dangerous, and then we'll let you out. Yeah.
Well, so okay, so where do you fall? I'm curious now that you're laying out these different schools of thought on this. I mean, where do you fall, and how does that translate into your view of individual responsibility?
So I'll answer your question in a second. I just want to point out that we're talking about the real heart of everything in free will responsibility. My book is, there's other questions and we can talk about them, but I just want people to know that the entire book isn't about this, but I would say the heart of it is. And that in chapter 5, I ally myself with Robert Kane, who I mentioned before, who's a metaphysical libertarian, and I try to show how indeterminism is in fact necessary for and compatible with genuine responsibility. The fundamental problem in showing that is so you have this person, this self, who's making a decision. And we've already seen the problem. If determinism is true, it looks like there's no genuine option there. It's an illusion, right? Whatever I end up doing, I had to do and I couldn't have done otherwise, and that doesn't look like free will. So you say, okay, well, let's assume an indeterministic picture, that there's quantum indeterminacy and that's in my brain, and so things are not necessarily determined to go one way or the other. That looks like now I have free will. And again, the argument against that is no, it's just a bunch of neurons knocking together, but it's kind of up to chance now. It's up to a flip of a coin in a sense. It's not up to me.
It's just something else that looks like free will, but isn't in fact, right?
Yeah, it's not determined, but it's no more free than if it were determined. So how do I reconcile self-determinism, which seems to be the essence of responsibility, with indeterminism? And so you have to put, and Robert Kane does this, and a few others. There's some agent causationists out there that's they try to show how the agent can, the self, this person, can have a genuine option, not be determined to choose one option or the other, and still be responsible for which way that agent goes. And it's very hard to do. I mean, it may seem, for people who haven't been through, really thought through this problem, it just seems like it's just obvious. It's up to me, and I can go this way or I can go that way. But it's very hard to get around the randomness objection that I just sort of happen to go this way, or lurch this way, or I lurch that way. That doesn't look like free will. So how do you get free will out of indeterminism? And so that's what I try to do. But I do, in the next chapter, I do argue that while I I do subscribe to that theory, that picture. It really is a very dangerous picture. And this was what I was alluding to before. Political libertarians who believe that, I mean, fundamentally their belief is we should have very small government to maximize individuals' liberty, right?
Right.
So one version of this is we're all atoms kind of, there's no society, there's no community, there's just a lot of atoms, acting in their own self-interest. And we need the government to sort of be as small as possible to let these atoms flourish, right? To flourish as they will. So deregulation and just staying out of the way. All we really need government for is security, safety. So we have police departments, fire departments, military, but that's it. We really don't need them for anything else. Certainly not for a social safety net, because that's oppressive and it minimizes liberty and it tells everybody what they need to do. That's sort of the political libertarian picture. And I argue that picture, which I fundamentally disagree with. I'm a big social safety net guy. I believe strongly in that. I'm a progressive. That picture, I think, presupposes metaphysical libertarianism, this genuine responsibility. So you often hear political libertarians, who tend to be Republicans, saying people need to take personal responsibility, and if they're doing badly in life, that's on them. And why should the government have to bail them out? Which we've been hearing a lot, not about companies, but about people lately. Why should the government have to bail out these failures? They failed on their own. They chose to fail. That's on them. Tough luck. Right?
They made bad choices. Right.
But that whole picture presupposes metaphysical libertarianism, which I, in the previous chapter, just defended.
Yeah.
So yeah. I want to sever the tie, basically, and say, even if you agree with me that metaphysical libertarianism is true, beware, because you do not want to be, you do not want to adopt this normative or political theory on that basis. So I haven't seen many philosophers talk about the connection between those two theories. So I tried to really flesh it out and then caution against it.
Well, let me ask this then, because I understand the goal of somebody who is going to defend a theory, whether it's a theory of the universe or a theory of free will, to then have to defend all the spin-off consequences of that particular viewpoint. But I mean, couldn't there be a blend of these varying strands of thought? In other words, we start with what you're calling metaphysical libertarianism, that we do have real choices over our decisions, over our actions. But it is also true that there are other billiard balls on the billiard table that can influence us. So somebody who grows up in in a social circumstance that we'd want to take into account when considering punishment or considering sentence. Can't we say, for instance, about that person, they had free will, but we should discount, say, punishment or the length of a criminal sentence because there were these other factors that don't necessarily relieve that person of free will, but are factors, just as the laws of nature can be a factor, just as the laws of physics can be a factor. Is there the possibility to look for ways to blend these things, particularly when we want to apply them to, how we think about the criminal law, how we think about individual responsibility, and holding people accountable based on that responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are four excuses that come to mind: the rotten social background excuse, the affluenza defense, the abuse excuse, and then what I talk about in chapter 8 of my book, situationism. But all of them are involve what you just raised, which is positive influences on me. One way I try to I think about, and I'll get to those excuses at least in the four of them generally. I don't have to go through each one, but is that we are born into these bodies, right? So when people think, oh, we have free will and we're responsible, and I mean, you're born into this machine. I mean, I liken it in chapter 5 to we're kind of like computers in the sense that computers have hardware and software, right? The hardware is the body, the software is the program. Well, our hardware are our bodies and brains, and the software is kind of the program in our brains, right? And we all have different personalities and senses of humor and different quirks, and so a computer is going to operate on the basis of not only its program but the inputs, right? The environmental inputs, what you type into it, basically. Mm-hmm. Well, we're not that different, right? We're born these babies, with this program and this hardware, and over the next 10 years, let's say we don't have free will until we're 10. I'll just arbitrarily stipulate that. We have all these inputs from parents, we get hurt, food. I mean,
right. Some people
language,
think the gut is the real brain.
Right. And but our program is, we still are born with a certain personality, and it might change around the edges over time. We might be, learn anger management, right? So you were born an angry person or short fuse, but eventually you work that or whatever it is. But the idea is we have certain talents, Michael Jordan was born to be a basketball player, right? I mean, so Beethoven was born to be a musician. These are programmed into our brain by forces outside our control. So I want to emphasize that when we reach this planet, when we are born, nothing is up to us, right? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Now, most people think, but at the age of 10 or 12 or 18, that's when it all became up to me. But that machine really was not at all self-developed until that age, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it was entirely developed. So even if it takes control at some point, the machine that's taking control was itself not in control of that machine, right? So, I mean, it gets it's hard to articulate, but so when we talk about causative influences or formative influences, people tend to discount that. When they see a criminal on at the defense table, they see that person. It's very two-dimensional. They see that person and that crime, right? The murder. I'll go back to you sitting at I know you're a lawyer, but or your client.
Don't put me at the defense table, Ken. That's
yeah. Sorry about that. But let's put Aaron Hernandez, because I just watched the series on Netflix. Now, many people knew him as a superstar athlete, but you can imagine that there's many other Aaron Hernandezes out there who are not famous and all people see, whether it's jurors, the public, is a two-dimensional picture of that person and that murder or those murders, right? But they're missing the third dimension, which is, I don't know how, let's say he was 25 years of history. And most of those years of history were not at all created by him. I mean, they made him what he is.
Yeah.
Right.
Everything from his DNA to his childhood to the food he ate as a developing human to all kinds of factors.
And some people might say, "Oh, you're just trying to excuse everybody." No. I mean, I'm just stating facts here, right? And then the question is, what are the implications of those facts? The normative, the moral, and the legal implications. You could make a very compelling argument that because I never created this machine, this hardware or the software, nothing that this machine does is up to the machine. It's not up. You can't blame the computer for. I mean, you really can't. I mean, if your computer breaks down, I mean, you can't blame the computer. What are you going to put it in jail? I mean, but we are in a sense very, very. We're just what they call it wetware, right? We're kind of biological computers in the sense that we never really determined ourselves. Now that again that's all the skeptical picture, but you don't even have to adopt the skeptical picture to say, well, wait, if somebody's abused at a very early age, and I'm talking about severe abuse, like let's say severe sexual abuse between the ages of 5 and 10, well, that's going to change that machine dramatically from what that machine might have done, that person. I keep calling it a machine just to highlight the analogy here. But let's say that 5 to 10 years old, that person's sexually abused. At the age of 17 or 18, that person goes on to sexually abuse somebody else. Now, if we're looking at that two-dimensionally, oh my God, that's awful. They sexually abuse somebody, put them in jail. They're dangerous. They're a horrible person. But when you bring in that third dimension, they were abused between the ages of 5 to 10. That trauma kind of changed them, changed the program through no fault of their own. And also modeling, right? They learned, oh, okay, this is appropriate, or this. But I would say between the trauma and the modeling, they became a different person. And how do you blame that person for that change? You can't. That was inflicted on them. So it is at least mitigating, I think. Those 5 years of sexual abuse are at least mitigating. They dramatically help us to understand why that person went on to commit the same kind of crime. And then we get into the question, should it fully excuse them? Now, most people would say no, because they're dangerous, they still did it, and so on. But you could easily make a case that they are not at all responsible, but we still need to punish them for all the good consequences that will yield, recognizing how unfair it is, because really, in the end, they did not freely do that. Right. And that's kind of what I think drives the skeptical position, is that all of us are more or less in that situation, whether we're abused or not. All of us were formed through influences outside our control, and therefore none of us are responsible for anything we do. They're just taking it to its logical extreme. So we got to really rethink responsibility and blaming and punishing and all those institutions. By the way, I should also mention, it's not just criminal law where these implications, the skeptics and the compatibilists and the libertarians, they also think this is very important for our social interactions. So, even, forget about criminal law. If you invite me to a party, so I'm very excited, I'm going to go to your party. And then the night before you say, you know what, I don't want you coming to my party after all. I don't like you. Well, normally we get angry, we resentful, I might yell at you. I might try to ruin your reputation, whatever it is, right? We're going to have angry, resentful reactions. Likewise, if you invited me to your party and didn't disinvite me, I might like you more, and I might think you're a really swell fellow. Well, all of these reactions and attitudes are, in a sense, predicated on the assumption of responsibility. Because if you're determined to invite me and then disinvite me, and I'm a skeptic, well, I can't really blame you. You were determined to do it, right? So
you can't blame me, you can't credit me, right?
Exactly.
Makes no
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah. I knew that we were going to have a rollicking conversation when the subject was free will, and I think we're just giving folks a taste of all the many ways that this goes so much further than the first question, which is, do we actually have free will, and the many implications, principally in the criminal law, but as you point out, in many other aspects of law and just social interaction generally. So great conversation and great book, which I'm enjoying, and I'm going to finish tonight after we've now spoken. Free Will, Responsibility, and Crime, an Introduction by Ken Levy. Ken is the Holt Harrison Professor of Law at the Law School at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. Given what everybody is saying about the way the numbers in this coronavirus are trending, I know we're all concerned about Louisiana, and I hope that you and your family and everyone on your campus and in your community stay safe and well in the weeks ahead, Ken. And thank you so much again for being my guest on Good Law, Bad Law. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you too. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, be safe, not both you and the audience. Just stay at home.
Yeah.
Practice social distancing.
Make good choices.
Yep. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ken.